Diane Holloway was a respected suburban wife. Emily Carter was her son's bright and ambitious girlfriend. What began as a warm friendship between two women turned into a dark obsession and ended in murder. In a quiet neighborhood where nothing ever happened, one secret shattered everything. The Holloway family had always appeared perfectly ordinary. To their neighbors, they were quiet, polite, and well-kept. Their home sat on a cul-de-sac lined with trimmed hedges and bright lawns, a snapshot of small-town peace. Mark Holloway, the father, worked as an insurance broker in a nearby city. He left the house early every morning, dressed in the same crisp suit, returning just before dinner. Diane, his wife of 25 years, stayed home. She cooked, cleaned, and volunteered twice a week at the local community center. Their only son, Ryan, was in his final year of university. He visited on weekends and holidays, often bringing along his girlfriend, Emily. Emily had met Ryan during a literature class. She was bright, ambitious, and gentle in her manner. Her parents lived in another state, so she often spent time at the Holloway's house. Diane had taken to her immediately. She saw in Emily a mix of kindness and warmth that she hadn't felt in years. At first, she told herself it was only because she missed the company. Ryan had been growing more distant, and Mark was always buried in work or watching the evening news. Emily was young, interesting, and full of life. She made Diane laugh again. She listened. The bond between the two women developed naturally, or so it seemed. Emily would stay after Ryan had gone out with friends, helping Diane with dishes or chatting over tea. Diane started texting Emily directly, sharing recipes, asking about her classes, and inviting her over for errands or planning family events. Ryan didn't think much of it. He thought it was nice that his mom and girlfriend got along. He encouraged it, grateful that it meant fewer awkward family dinners and more harmony. What Ryan didn't notice was how quickly Diane's admiration for Emily grew into something more complicated. Diane, in her quiet solitude, began to look forward to every text from Emily. Every accidental brush of a hand or laugh shared during a quiet afternoon began to linger in her mind longer than it should. Diane had never questioned her identity before. She had played the part of the wife and mother for so long that she didn't recognize the stirrings of something deeper. But with Emily, something woke up inside her that had been buried for decades. At first, it was subtle. Diane started dressing differently on weekends when Emily was expected. She bought new skincare products and tried different hairstyles. She began taking more selfies, always with the excuse of needing a profile photo for the community bulletin or family chat group. Emily noticed, but she didn't say anything. She chalked it up to Diane simply enjoying her company. The truth was harder to see because it was hidden beneath decades of routine and societal expectations. Meanwhile, Mark was becoming more and more detached. He barely noticed the shift in his wife's behavior. To him, everything seemed stable. The bills were paid, dinner was served, and there was no conflict. He had long accepted the slow silence that settled over their marriage. What he didn't know was that in that silence, something dangerous had started to bloom. Over time, Emily became more aware of Diane's attentiveness. The compliments lingered too long. The glances became harder to explain. Diane began showing up unannounced at Emily's part-time job or waiting outside her classes to offer her rides home. Emily tried to convince herself it was harmless. Diane had always been kind. Maybe she was just lonely. Maybe this was normal for a woman whose son was growing up and starting his own life. But something in her gut told her to be cautious. Still, she said nothing to Ryan. She didn't want to upset the balance or risk hurting his relationship with his mother. She hoped that if she just created some distance, things would settle down. But Diane noticed the shift immediately, and the withdrawal felt like betrayal. What had once been a quiet connection began to turn into an obsession. Diane kept track of Emily's schedule. She saved photos of them together, printed text messages, and started writing in a journal about her feelings. She told herself it wasn't wrong. that Emily needed her, even if she didn't realize it yet. In Diane's mind, this wasn't just infatuation. It was something deeper, something she believed fate had given her after a life of quiet disappointment. No one else saw the danger forming. Ryan was focused on finishing school. Mark was buried in work, and Emily was too unsure to speak up. The surface of the Holloway family remained calm, the picture of order and stability. But underneath, cracks had started to form, cracks that would soon split wide open, revealing a truth that no one could have predicted. Emily knew something was wrong, but couldn't explain it clearly. Diane's attention had grown overwhelming. What once felt like kindness was beginning to feel like pressure. Her texts were more frequent, often filled with compliments that made Emily uncomfortable. There were late-night messages that went unanswered, followed by long, emotional replies the next morning, apologizing, then repeating the same pattern days later. Diane was no longer just the warm, welcoming woman she had once admired. She had become unpredictable, intense, and strangely possessive. Despite her unease, Emily kept her distance from confrontation. She didn't know how to bring it up to Ryan. She feared the damage it might do to his relationship with his mother, especially since she couldn't point to anything concrete. Just a growing sense of being watched, followed, and slowly trapped. She limited visits to the Holloway home, started leaving earlier during weekends, and avoided one-on-one time with Diane. But avoidance wasn't enough. Diane noticed every small change and took each one personally. Diane's mental state began to deteriorate. She stopped sleeping properly, obsessed over small interactions, and constantly replayed conversations in her mind. She convinced herself that Emily was confused, scared of what she was feeling, and needed reassurance. She believed Emily loved her too, even if she didn't say it aloud. Every ignored message fed into Diane's paranoia. Every polite but distant answer felt like a rejection. Eventually, Diane crossed a line. One evening when Ryan was away for the weekend and Mark was working late, she invited Emily over under the pretense of helping with a charity event. Emily hesitated but agreed, hoping it would ease the growing tension. That night changed everything. Something happened, something that blurred boundaries and pushed past what Emily had thought was possible. Diane acted with certainty, as though what she felt had been mutual all along. Emily, shocked and shaken, left without saying much. She didn't tell Ryan what had occurred, but from that moment forward, everything between her and Diane shifted. Diane, however, saw it differently. In her mind, what had happened confirmed everything she had hoped for. She became more attached, convinced they now shared a secret connection. Her messages grew even more intense. She called repeatedly, even during Emily's lectures. When Emily didn't respond, Diane would appear near her campus or job, always with an excuse, a gift, or a sudden emotional crisis that demanded attention. Emily was trapped. She knew she couldn't keep it hidden from Ryan forever, but she also feared what would happen if she told him. She felt guilt for letting things go as far as they had, even though she hadn't wanted it. She feared being blamed, being misunderstood. So she stayed silent, growing more anxious each day. Meanwhile, Mark finally began to notice something was off. Diane had grown emotionally distant from him, no longer hiding her contempt for their marriage. She avoided touch, conversation, and sometimes even meals. He suspected depression or midlife burnout, but she refused to talk to him about it. He didn't press the issue, chalking it up to aging and discontent. He had no idea what was really going on. Ryan, on the other hand, was becoming suspicious. Emily had changed. She was quiet, distracted, and seemed hesitant when asked to visit. At first, he thought it was stress from school, but when he mentioned his mom, her expression would shift. She'd nod, but her tone was tight. Something wasn't right. Diane's behavior escalated. She began threatening self-harm in messages to Emily, saying she couldn't take the silence, that she had given everything and was being abandoned. Emily started deleting the texts, afraid of what they meant and what might happen if anyone saw them. But inside, she was breaking down. She couldn't keep the secret much longer. Everything was spiraling. The lines between guilt, confusion, and fear blurred into a constant hum of anxiety. Emily was afraid of Diane, but also afraid of what the truth would do to the Holloway family. She couldn't imagine destroying Ryan's trust or being blamed for something she hadn't fully understood until it was too late. But Diane had crossed a threshold and wasn't coming back. She was consumed by obsession, and any attempt by Emily to pull away only made things worse. Her mind was no longer grounded in reality. She believed they were bound together by something stronger than reason, and she would do anything to keep it, no matter the cost. Emily's world was closing in around her. The stress had begun to seep into every corner of her life. Her classes suffered. She avoided friends. Her sleep came in short bursts, interrupted by nightmares she couldn't fully remember. She no longer felt safe, not even in her own apartment. Diane's presence had become impossible to escape. If it wasn't texts or calls, it was surprise visits near campus or long, handwritten letters left at her door. Each one carried a tone of desperate affection mixed with veiled threats and emotional guilt. Emily felt like she was being smothered, but she still couldn't bring herself to expose the truth. She began making excuses to Ryan, canceling plans, saying she was too tired or behind on schoolwork. He noticed the change, asked questions, but she always brushed him off. His concern slowly turned into frustration. The more he tried to bridge the gap, the more distant she became. He couldn't understand what had gone wrong. To him, their relationship had been stable. Now it was unraveling, and he didn't know why. Meanwhile, Diane was living in a completely different version of reality. In her mind, Emily was pulling away because of outside pressure, not because of anything she had done. She believed Emily still cared for her, even loved her, and that the only thing keeping them apart was fear. Diane saw herself as a victim of an unfair situation, trapped in a loveless marriage, misunderstood, and now abandoned by the one person who truly saw her. Her obsession only deepened. She began documenting everything: photos of Emily taken secretly, notes from their conversations, timestamps of their meetings. She filled notebooks with pages that read like diaries and confessions, blending fantasy and fact. To Diane, this was proof of their connection, something she believed would one day be seen as real and justified. Emily, pushed to the edge, finally confided in someone. She told her roommate, Mia, everything. Mia listened, horrified, and immediately urged Emily to go to the police or at least tell Ryan. But Emily refused. She couldn't bear the thought of destroying someone's family, especially not his. She believed, naively, that if she just stayed away, the problem would go away on its own. But Diane wasn't letting go. She began to lose control. Her messages became darker. She accused Emily of betrayal, of using her, of making promises and then running. There were no promises, of course, not in the way Diane believed. But her mind had twisted every moment of kindness into something deeper. Every boundary Emily tried to place became another act of rejection, another wound. One night, Diane showed up outside Emily's apartment. She waited in her car for hours. Emily didn't see her, but Mia did and called campus security. By the time they arrived, Diane had driven off. It was the first official incident, and though it didn't lead to legal action, it planted a seed of concern in official records. Mia warned Emily again that this wasn't just emotional manipulation anymore. It was stalking. It was dangerous. Emily knew she had to do something. She began writing a detailed account of everything that had happened. Names, dates, locations, messages, she documented it all. She planned to confront Diane once and for all, to make it clear that whatever had happened between them had to end completely. She hoped that a firm, final boundary would stop the downward spiral. She never got the chance. Ryan, still unaware of the full story, had planned a weekend for just the two of them to reconnect. Emily agreed, thinking it might be good for her mental state. She needed clarity, space, and time to think. Diane found out. Whether it was through social media, a passing comment, or her own watchful habits, no one knew for sure. But when she learned that Emily would be spending a weekend alone with Ryan, something in her snapped. She stayed up all night the evening before they left. She reread old messages, flipped through her notebooks, stared at printed photos until her eyes blurred. She convinced herself that Emily had lied to her, used her, and now was going back to pretend none of it ever happened. That kind of betrayal, in her eyes, was unforgivable. That Diane's thoughts became erratic, consumed by vengeance and heartbreak. Her fantasies shifted from reconciliation to punishment. She no longer cared about consequences. She wanted Emily to feel the pain she believed had been inflicted on her. Diane felt cornered and humiliated, and that combination made her dangerous. Why the next day, Emily was missing. Her phone was turned off. She hadn't returned any messages. Ryan assumed she was late or had forgotten to pack something. But hours passed, then an entire day. Panic set in. He called her friends, her roommate, her family. No one had seen or heard from her. A missing persons report was filed, and quietly, in her kitchen, Diane sat alone with a calm expression on her face, as if nothing had changed. Ryan was pacing in his parents' living room, phone clutched in his hand, face pale and panicked. It had been over 24 hours since Emily's last text. She had promised to meet him for a weekend away, just the two of them, something they both had seemed to need. But she never showed. No calls, no texts, no activity on her social media. He had called her friends, her roommate, even professors, but no one had seen her since she left campus 2 days ago. Something felt terribly wrong, and every passing hour only made the silence louder. The police were now involved. A missing person case had been opened. Officers took statements, asked about mental health, relationship troubles, possible reasons for running away. Ryan insisted she wasn't the type to vanish. Her roommate confirmed she'd been stressed, but there was no indication that Emily would just leave without saying a word. The detectives listened carefully, took notes, and assured them they were doing everything they could. But in a case like this, early leads mattered, and there were few. Mark tried to calm his son down, repeating logical theories to try to make sense of the situation. But Ryan wasn't convinced. He felt it in his gut. This wasn't just someone needing space. Something had happened. Diane, sitting quietly in the corner of the room, watched everything unfold with a strange calmness. She offered comforting words, made tea, answered questions from the police without hesitation. She didn't show fear or concern. Her face was a mask of quiet helpfulness, but behind her eyes, there was something cold, unreadable. 2 days later, Emily's car was found. It had been parked 2 blocks from the Holloway residence, locked, with her phone, bag, and wallet still inside. There were no signs of forced entry or a struggle. To detectives, this was a turning point. The location was suspicious, and the lack of personal belongings raised serious red flags. They asked the family again if Emily had ever come to the house recently. Mark said no. Ryan said not in weeks. Diane hesitated, then said Emily hadn't visited in a while either. But that wasn't true. A review of nearby CCTV footage showed a figure matching Emily's appearance walking down the street toward the Holloway house on the evening she disappeared. The quality of the footage was poor, but it was enough to warrant a warrant. The police returned to the house, this time with search orders in hand. Mark was shocked. He couldn't understand why his home was being searched in connection to a missing persons case. But Diane remained still, her hands folded in her lap. As officers moved through the house, opening closets, cabinets, and eventually making their way to the basement, Diane didn't move from her chair. She simply stared out the window, detached from the chaos that lay in the basement, tucked behind old boxes and plastic bins. A large industrial freezer stood humming softly. Inside, hidden beneath layers of frozen food, was Emily's body, wrapped in a tarp, still dressed in the clothes she had worn the night she disappeared. The sight silenced the room. Diane was arrested immediately. Mark stood frozen in disbelief. Ryan broke down completely. The woman they thought they knew, the quiet, devoted wife and mother, was at the center of a crime neither of them could have imagined. At the police station, Diane confessed without hesitation. She said it calmly, as though explaining something simple. She had invited Emily over to talk. She offered her tea, laced with sleeping pills. When Emily passed out, Diane placed a pillow over her face and held it there until she stopped breathing. She claimed it was painless. She said she had done it out of love, to end the confusion and heartbreak for both of them. In her mind, it wasn't murder. It was a final act of emotional release. The news spread quickly. A respected housewife killing her son's girlfriend in a quiet suburban neighborhood was the kind of story that captured national attention. The media swarmed the street. Neighbors were interviewed. Photos of Diane and Emily appeared everywhere, fueling speculation and shock. People who had once admired Diane now struggled to understand what had gone so wrong. The community was stunned, but no one more so than Ryan. He couldn't reconcile the woman who raised him with the one who had committed such a terrible act. He blamed himself for not noticing the signs, for not asking more questions, for trusting her so completely. Mark filed for divorce weeks later, unable to live under the weight of the truth. Diane, now awaiting trial, remained emotionless in court. She listened to the charges, answered questions from her lawyers, and never once expressed remorse. In her mind, the story was already finished. She had done what she felt had to be done. She had taken something pure and ended it before it could turn against her. But for everyone else, it was far from over. The courtroom was packed the day Diane Holloway's trial began. Journalists filled the benches, cameras lined the sidewalk. Outside, and spectators waited in long lines just to witness what had become one of the most disturbing cases in the state's history. A suburban mother, with no criminal record or history of violence, had killed her son's girlfriend and hidden the body in her own home. The media called it shocking, neighbors called it unthinkable, and those closest to the family could only describe it as impossible. Ryan sat in the second row, eyes locked on the woman who had raised him. He hadn't spoken to his mother since her arrest. Every attempt to write her a letter had ended in crumpled paper and silence. He was grieving the loss of Emily and the loss of the mother he thought he knew. Neither made sense. Both felt like different versions of the same nightmare. Prosecutors presented a timeline of obsession, manipulation, and emotional instability. They revealed the text messages Diane had sent to Emily, hundreds of them, many laced with jealousy, control, and desperation. They read diary entries aloud, describing Diane's growing fixation and the fantasy world she had built around Emily's presence in her life. They called it a delusion that turned deadly. The evidence was overwhelming. Photos printed and stored in drawers. Handwritten letters never sent. A carefully preserved collection of keepsakes that painted a picture of a mind unraveling to Emily's roommate. Mia testified about the stalking, the messages, and the night Diane had waited outside their apartment. Her words brought gasps from the audience. She described Emily's fear, her anxiety, and the last few weeks before she disappeared. She said Emily had been planning to end all contact, to finally tell Ryan the truth. But she never got the chance. The defense tried to argue diminished capacity. They claimed Diane had suffered a psychological break, decades of emotional repression, an unhappy marriage, and unresolved identity issues culminating in a single act of desperation. But Diane never appeared confused or remorseful. She listened quietly to the proceedings, her face blank, as though she was watching someone else's life play out. When asked if she had anything to say, she declined. Ryan took the stand briefly. He spoke not about his mother's crime, but about Emily, who she was, how she lived, and what she meant to him. His voice trembled, but he spoke clearly. He wanted people to remember Emily for more than how she died. She had loved literature, wanted to teach, and made people feel safe. He said she didn't deserve to be pulled into someone else's private collapse. The courtroom sat in silence as he left the stand, head lowered, heart broken. After days of testimony and evidence, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all charges: premeditated murder, unlawful disposal of a body, and obstruction of justice. Diane was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She showed no reaction as the judge read the sentence. She stood, nodded once, and was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, leaving behind the wreckage of a life once considered ordinary. The house on Willow Lane was sold within months. Mark moved out of state, unable to face the reminders that lingered in every room. He retired early and refused interviews. Ryan finished school, but withdrew from public life entirely. He lived quietly, far from the cameras and curiosity, grieving. In his own way, the scars left by Diane's actions would never fully heal. The community tried to return to normal. Another family moved into the house, repainting the walls and planting new flowers, hoping to bury the past beneath fresh beginnings. But some memories clung to the air. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones, still unsure how someone who baked cookies for block parties could be capable of murder. Years later, documentaries would revisit the case. True crime channels would analyze every detail, from the first text message to the moment the freezer was opened. Psychologists debated whether Diane had truly lost touch with reality or had simply acted on twisted impulse. But no theory ever fully explained the horror of what happened to Diane in the end. It was a story about silence, what people hide, what they refuse to face, and how something dangerous can grow quietly in the corners of everyday life. Diane Holloway's love turned into obsession, her longing into violence. And in the space between who she was and what she became, a young woman lost her life, and a family lost everything.